So, 68, remember, who gets elected in 1960?
Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy. What happens to him within 3 years? He gets killed. And so who takes over? LBJ. Okay? And does he win in 64?
Yes.
He could have been dead and he would have been elected in 64. Kind of. The point is that the remorse, the image, everything that was associated with JFK was then imbued in LBJ because he took it. He did that deliberately. And so there's no way he's going to lose in 64. It doesn't matter who the Republican is, he's going to win. But then this is the weird thing. And this is kind of what we were trying to talk about last Wednesday. And maybe you got it, maybe you didn't catch it. What did LBJ have to do in 1968? Did he want to run? Could he legally run? Because it'd be more than 2 terms, right? Could he legally run? Absolutely. What's the constitutional limit? How many years can you run? 2 terms, but how many years? 10 years, right? So if you finish somebody else's term, you can do a total of 10 years, no more than 2 terms. So he's more than legally able to do this. And he actually was running. And then he had to pull out in early 68. And why does he do that? No, it's not because of the war. And this is something that, frankly, sometimes your textbooks will tell you this. And unfortunately, a lot of historians will tell you this. But if you're reading the material, if you read the stuff related to the election, the war is not an issue. It's not the war. The war becomes a major issue in 1969. And why is that famous? Aside from the fact that that's when I was born. Aside from the fact that that's when the first man lands on the moon. What's also famous about 1969 in terms of presidential politics? Whoever was elected is already there. So it cannot have affected the 68 election. In 69, the president's already there. Right? It's not going to affect the election. What was affecting this election was not Vietnam. Nixon wins in 68. Nixon wins in 72 by the largest landslide in history up to that point. Huge, right? Huge. Why? What does Nixon have that makes him win? And remember, nobody is going to touch LBJ in 64. He's like unstoppable. So why doesn't he win in 68? What happened between 64 and 68? And this was kind of the argument that I was trying to make. LBJ did something pretty amazing between 64 and 68 that secured his base. He also secured the Democrats. It's a term you guys don't know. I will give it to you now. What does this mean? Realignment. You just take a logical guess, a realignment. Think of your car, realignment. You're making sure you're changing the way, the order. Okay. So what happens is, if you recall, the Democratic Party, basically from the 1840s, which is pre-Civil War, right? And this is important because it's one of the reasons why we had the Civil War. And certainly during the Civil War and after the Civil War, up until this election, up until 1964. The Democratic Party's constituent means the people that vote for the Democrats, were going to be the South plus whoever else. And you remember this. Remember the election of 1896 and the populist moment? Do you remember William Jennings Bryan running as a Democratic candidate? Remember, the Democrats had lost in Cleveland. And then Cleveland wins in 1892. And the country's kind of surprised because, of course, the South, the Democrats of the South, and the Southerners lost the Civil War. Now remember, Cleveland is not a Southerner, he's a Northerner. Yes? Grover Cleveland. Yes, sorry. Totally wrong. Grover Cleveland, thank you, because he's blue. Okay, so Grover Cleveland, right? But the point is that the reason why he's winning is that they had managed to capture those folks that had nothing to do with the Civil War. And who in 1896 would have had nothing to do with the Civil War? Remember, 1896, it's only 30 years earlier. Who would have had nothing to do with the Civil War? Immigrants. So where are they living? Urban areas. And so the way that the Democrats were able to do this is that they have the South plus other people. Some of them are urban, some are the worker types. It's not absolutely clear. This, however, is where FDR gets his support. In 1896, they tried to get the rural area, but remember, William Jennings Bryan sunk the campaign because he goes around with this cross of gold speech saying that the farmers are the ones that build America. The farmers are the ones upon which everything thrives. If you crucify the farmers on this cross of gold, meaning the gold standard, then the cities are going to dry up. And by doing that, he alienates the urbanites. The urbanites were the ones that caused Cleveland to win. And by alienating them, they lost that constituency. McKinley wins, and from that point on, the Republicans become progressive. They have this progressive, and they take all the issues that the populists have, and they dominate the urban areas for the next 20 plus years. 30 years, really. You remember the important thing about 1912 was that you had 4 candidates. All of them called themselves progressives, and the only reason why the Democrat won was that the 2 Republicans split the vote. So the point is that constituency, that urban constituency, was a winning constituency. We talked about this as a result of the industrialization. Because of industrialization, the urban folks are growing. The farmer folks are not growing. So they capture. What happens with FDR is that he recaptures the urban vote. And he does it by changing the definition of reform. Remember, Coolidge and Hoover were saying reform was restraint. And he is now saying reform is action. Federal government will do things for you. By doing that, he captures the urban vote. So by the time we get up to 64, LBJ has a Democratic Party whose main constituents is the South and urbanites. But there's a problem with that formula. What's the problem with that formula? We talked about this. JFK is a northerner from Massachusetts. Does he support civil rights? He's a northerner from Massachusetts. Went to Harvard. Does he support civil rights? Yeah, hugely, right? But can he actively present political reforms for civil rights? Why not? Because as a Democrat, his South, his constituent, is based on the South plus other folks. Now what LBJ does is that when JFK dies, he takes this memory, because everybody knows that Kennedy supports civil rights, even though he's not allowed to actually publicly support it. He can't support a civil rights bill. Civil rights bill that's created by the Republicans. The Republicans, by the way, are constantly submitting civil rights bills. Why are they doing this? 2 really easy reasons. Someone come up with one of them. Why are the Republicans throughout the 50s? Remember 1957, Civil Rights Bill 1957. President Eisenhower passes or supports this bill. The Congress, the Republicans in Congress push it through and he signs on it. The Republicans love to submit civil rights bill. Why do they do it? 2 reasons. No, because it's not really a federal issue, although it's an excellent guess.
Are you talking about after World War II?
After World War II.
Is the thing about Hitler?
Yes, of course, they love to support it because number 1, the country supports the civil rights bills. So it's an easy bill to promote. It's an easy issue. But what's number 2? Maybe less obvious. The Republicans support this, and what do they know is going to happen on the other side of the aisle? They can't support it, and this is a terrible thing, right? So you get people like Bobby Kennedy, John Kennedy, okay? He he supports these bills, but he can't publicly support them. Do you know what that puts you in? What kind of position that puts you into? So, of course, the Republicans like to submit these bills left and right because they know that a lot of these very famous Northern Democrats who would actually personally support these bills, they have to be quiet about it because their constituent base is in the South. What kind of mean torture is that? The country, by the way, is very much in favor of civil rights. We talked about this, especially after World War II. And so, what LBJ does is he knows this. He's very wise politically. He is from Texas. He's the first Texas president, but of course he's not elected. He's really there because of the death of John F. Kennedy. He's old. John F. Kennedy was young. He's from Texas. He's not from the North. If he does nothing unusual, people may not support him. They may not link him with John F. Kennedy. So what he has to do is really claim the mantle of Kennedy. Even though he's old, he's going to do something that's young. What's young? Civil rights. Civil rights is for young people. Civil rights is right after World War II. Civil rights is like new. It's the future. So he is going to promote civil rights, and by doing that, he sacrifices his Southern constituency. But he doesn't lose on this, because he also promotes the Great Society. You remember what the Great Society is. Great Society is also known in your textbook as the War on Poverty. What he's doing by having the Great Society and the War on Poverty is he's taking FDR's playbook and he's putting it on steroids. He wants the urban vote. He wants all of the urban vote. And so what he promises is federal money to fight poverty. And in his argument, racism comes from what? Poverty. Why is this kind of a magical combination? And you have to understand, this wasn't really done before. People were poor because they made bad decisions. But in 1964, LBJ is saying people are poor because there's kind of a racism in society. Because they don't have an opportunity. Because institutionally, it's uneven, it's unfair. So the federal government will get involved and help them. And so when you have federal money fighting poverty, what are you actually doing? That means that federal money fights racism also. How do you fight racism? You could pass a law, 1964, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Remember, Civil Rights Act of 1964 is a Republican bill. But LBJ absolutely supports it. He tells all of his Democrats, you better support this. I know you never have in the past, but we're doing something different here. It's a realignment. You support this. Also, we'll support the Voting Rights Act of 65. So we're going to be the party for civil rights. Remember, for years, 1840 to 1964, 125 years, they were the exact opposite party. They were the party against racial civil rights. But now, suddenly, they are the party for civil rights. And here's the trick. If you support this, right, then what we say is every time we spend federal dollars, we are fighting racism. We'll pass these two laws, but once you say racism is illegal, and once you provide a mechanism that says you get sued if you exhibit racist practices, what more can you do? Legally, what more can you do? Nothing, right? You can't do anything more. So what he's saying is that for us to really create a new society, a war on poverty, we have to end poverty, and that will end all the other racism. So what he does is he associates federal money with fighting racism. Why is this such a clever idea? What does that do by saying, if you want to end racism, You must support federal programs. The Great Society is a huge, massive expansion of the federal government. Some of the examples: Head Start, school lunch program. That seems so simple, we do that today, but what does that mean? That the federal government provides free lunches across the country for those that are poor. Only poor people, not everybody, just the poor people. Why is that an expansion of federal government? This is funny because actually nowadays you guys actually probably are aware of this. It's been in the news lately. About Michelle Obama's kind of guidelines on school lunches. What's in the news? Anybody been aware of this at all? Haven't seen it anywhere? Okay. Michelle Obama's been one of her issues is obesity, right? So she's got all these guidelines. Well, if the federal government pays for free lunches, even just a portion of it, if you give somebody money, what do you also get to do? You get to tell them how to spend the money. Prior to 64, the federal government had no role in education at all. Zero. Education was done locally. Your local community, your property taxes pays for the school. It's still what happens today. Our property taxes pay for the buildings, pay for the salaries of the school. But you can supplement that money through a bunch of federal programs. The first one was the school lunch program. And as soon as you receive $1 from the federal government, what does the federal government say? By the way, you have to do all these things in order to get this money. Now, some of this is good, right? Can you have a segregated school and get any federal money? Of course not. Now, segregation in the school has been illegal since 1954, so Johnson isn't responsible for doing this. But it takes a long time. The Supreme Court says basically with all due speed, you need to desegregate. Well, what does that mean, with all due speed? You can't do it like that day, so it takes a couple of years. Well, some people take longer. And this is what a lot of the protests of the late 50s were about, was that it was taking too long to segregate, desegregate. Well, with the school lunch program, LBJ in 64 and 65, the Great Society is basically able to mandate it right that moment. You don't get $1 unless you follow the desegregation. So everybody suddenly does all these rules. But it's just a little thing. Today, if you go to the school lunch, they tell you how many grams of protein the students has to have, how many types of vegetables, the color of the vegetables, how much they're able to have, how many times they're able to have seconds. They actually have recipes that the students are supposed to follow, that the schools are supposed to follow, because they get free and reduced lunch. Now, it's not just like the federal government saying, I'm going to give you this money. It actually works in a very complex way. The federal government subsidizes farmers. And so some of these farmers, the food goes into this commodity program, so that schools are able to buy cheaper ingredients because it's through this federal program. And so you can get a deal. So some of it's real money, but most of it's actually money in the form of cheaper products. And so then you're able to provide these lunches at a cheaper price. And then if you've got students that follow under the guidelines, then they will actually give you money to pay for those lunches. But for all that money, they have very, very strict guidelines. This becomes an expansion of the federal government in a way that makes FDR look a little bit weak. Another opportunity you guys didn't hear about, but you will in your book, economic opportunity. This is a program, EOC. This is a program also known as community action programs. CAP. So these are programs where the federal government will give grants directly to any group that's trying to organize urban programs. So if you are a boys and girls club, you're working with urban youth, you can get a federal grant and they'll pay for your program. If you have a after-school program for students at the school or at some center, that center can get money directly from the federal government, which means that the federal government doesn't go through the state and then the state give it to you, and it doesn't have to go through the local government. It goes directly from a federal government right to you. By doing this, lots and lots and lots of federal money, who becomes the next constituency for the Democrats? It's not the South anymore. It's urban. Have you guys seen the electoral maps of the past, 12 elections? You guys, they show maps of this. You're on the internet, right? So in 2012, 2008, 2004, 2000, they show a map county by county. So if you look at the country as a whole, it's entirely red. Red being Republican. And then you've got these blue spots. And where are the blue spots? Cities. That's been the same way for the past 25, 30 years. Because if you're an urban, if you're like in New York City or Chicago and you're dependent, in other words, you have an agency that is dependent upon federal money, are you going to vote for somebody who's promising to cut the federal government? No way. If you are a teacher and you've got money, part of your salary is coming from federal money that is offset through school lunch and reading programs and a bunch of other programs, are you going to vote for somebody who's promising to cut federal money? No. So what LBJ did, which is really brilliant, is that he shifted the constituency of the Democratic Party. It's called a realignment. He replaced the South with urban folks. Now, if that's the case, why doesn't he just scream in and absolutely dominate in 1968? Wouldn't this guarantee constant victory? You guys got to be smart here. Give me some answers. Creatively think. Office of Economic Opportunity, Equal Opportunity Employment Commission,